help but mention that October is the month that we lost Angola 3 member Herman Wallace.
Yes.
It's already been 10 years, but the conversations that I had with Herman are etched in my memory and firmly deep planted in my soul. Every October, I find myself reflecting on some of those conversations that I had with Herman. And as I was writing these remarks, Herman spoke to me. And so I'm going to begin tonight by allowing you access into a private conversation that I happen to have had with Herman. I'm arriving for one of my first visits to meet Herman Wallace in person, and we extend the routine greetings. And then Herman abruptly says, I have a question. And I said, sure. He says, I've been waiting to ask, so I'm not going to lose any time. And Herman says, which are you, my sister? Are you a leader or are you a revolutionary? And I said, Herman, I'm very ashamed to admit this, but the professor is unprepared for class. I didn't have an answer for Herman that day. So I said, Herman, I'm going to get back with you. And he said, no, this is way too important for us to delay this because I don't want leaders working in my movement. And Herman proceeded to share with me one of the most defining lessons of my life. Herman did what no teacher had done at that point, what no professor had ever done in my life, not even a clergy member. None of them had attempted to share with me what Herman said. And Herman proceeded to say to me, Professor Bell, a leader seeks to accomplish one thing, or maybe a few things that they can achieve in their lifetime. To a leader, a victory, Herman says, is a short distance run. The revolutionary, Herman goes on to say, has an entirely different measure of success. That revolutionary measures victory in incremental terms. The revolutionary is prepared to wait for cumulative gains to ferment over time. The revolutionary works for generations to come. The revolutionary, Herman tells me, is prepared for long suffering because that revolutionary wants system change. The revolutionary continuously causes a shift in what the public once thought was the best that man could ever achieve. Before I attempt to tell you what the Black Panther Party was not, let the record first show what they were. They were revolutionaries. And I think 64 Parishes Encyclopedia in Louisiana agrees. And that is why when I approached them, they honored my request to finally add an entry about Louisiana's Black Panther Party to their online encyclopedia of Louisiana's history. That was done in the year 2023. But I guess I would be venturing off to say that it would be a lot more difficult to convince someone of a higher stature than the staff at 64 parishes to do something similar. I'm thinking about maybe a mayor. I suspect that's probably just out of the realm of possibilities. And I think nobody here would likely object with my statement that we will never see that day. Does anyone object?
Yes.
I have a message on behalf of Mayor Latoya Cantrell. Whereas in 1970, during the national movement to advance civil rights, members of the Would the members of the Louisiana Black Panther Party please rise to be acknowledged? Whereas in 1970, during the national movement to advance civil rights, members of the Louisiana chapter of the Black Panther Party and the National Committee to Combat Fascism refused to be observers in a social struggle. They formed a chapter in the state of Louisiana to empower blacks and demand equal rights. And whereas the city of New Orleans recognized the courage, sacrifice, and noble efforts of members of the Louisiana chapter of the Black Panther Party and the National Committee to Combat Fascism. And whereas the city of New Orleans acknowledges the excesses visited upon the Louisiana chapter of the Black Panther Party and the National Committee to Combat Fascism in 1970 at the hands of city officials. And whereas the city of New Orleans recognized that impactful service members of the Louisiana chapter of Black Panther Party and the National Committee to Combat Fascism provided in New Orleans community and transformational impact they made in New Orleans during the time of a grave social struggle. And whereas the contributions of the members of the Louisiana chapter of the Black Panther Party and the National Committee to Combat Fascism transcend race, nationality, religion, and deem them worthy of recognition for their positive contribution to the struggle for human, civil, and political rights in the state of Louisiana and critical players in the Louisiana civil rights story. Now, therefore, I, LaToya Cantrell, Mayor of the City of New Orleans, hereby do recognize the Louisiana Alumni Association of the Black Panther Party, in witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the great seal of the City of New Orleans to be affixed to this 21st day of October in the year 2023.
Who is one of my law students, and when they heard about the plight of the Black Panther Party, they were determined to make city officials acknowledge the false narrative. And so this is the product of their efforts in writing letters and campaigning on behalf of the Black Panther Party. In October of 1966, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was founded in Oakland, California. It was co-founded by a law student named Huey Newton and a college student named Bobby Seale. They met and began organizing in college over the lack of an African American Studies program at the university that Seale was attending and that Newton had previously attended. That effort on that campus ended successfully, so they decided to test their vision in a broader space. And so they turned to the community of Oakland, and they asked the people in Oakland, California, for a list of concerns. And those responses became the 10-point plan, which served as the foundation for their work. And so I'm gonna ask as a professor for you to do a little assignment quickly. If you'll turn over the program, you can quickly look at this 10-point program that I'm speaking about. And I offer my opinion, we'll see if you agree, that the demands of the Black Panther Party were extremely reasonable and very legal. In fact, it is so mainstream in my view that it nearly mirrors the remarks that President Joe Biden offered when he signed the 2023 National Black History Month proclamation. President Biden said, and I quote, "The country was less established upon these ideas. It was a simple idea that people were created equal, that people should be treated equally. It is an idea that America has never fully lived up to."
right.
Black Americans still struggle, Biden says, for freedom, for equal treatment, for the right to vote, for equal opportunities in education, housing, and the workplace. Biden continues, the struggle is over economic opportunities, equal justice, and political representation. That 10-point plan that you see is abbreviated. If you look at the entire document, it cites language at the closing for the Declaration of Independence. And so what we can already see is that the contours of the Black Panther Party was a movement that was being shaped by the United States Constitution. The Black Panthers leaned heavily on the promises of the Constitution. They invigorated the First Amendment with their verbal and written artistic messages. They embraced the Second Amendment and bore arms upon the belief that armed self-defense was necessary for the protection of Black communities and against state-sanctioned violence. Because of Newton's legal training, they tested the country's fidelity to the Fourth Amendment by organizing police patrols in response to community complaints of brutality and unlawful searches and seizures. And they did this with law books in hand. And they resisted all attempts to render the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, Due Process Clause, mere platitudes. So you must understand this organizational blueprint that they laid was not impulse. It was intentional. It was deliberate. The Black Panthers built their framework upon the very liberating power of education and upon the notion that people learn through participation. They promoted education in communities and amongst their members. To be a good teacher, you have to learn first. And so members were required to study revolutions. Revolutions in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, in Cuba, amongst a host of other materials. Black Panther Party members lived in communal housing. They engaged in fundraising in order to sustain their programs. You see, they labor with no salary. They work from early morning into early night. And you say, well, what kinds of things were they doing, Professor Bell? You see, after they put on those sexy black leather jackets and those black berets, and they got all that attitude and that swagger, they went in the kitchen and they served food to school children. They opened free neighborhood clinics. They administered tests for sickle cell anemia, which was a major killer of African Americans. They also raised the medical community's awareness of this disease. There was so little known about sickle cell anemia during the days of the Panthers. The Panthers' political lobbying led to the passage of the country's very first Sickle Cell Act. And President Richard Nixon even mentions their sickle cell disease for the first time in a State of the Union address when the Panthers were in existence. The Panthers operated an award-winning community school in California. It was so successful that the California legislature issued a commendation on behalf of this Oakland Community Learning Center for having set the standard for the highest level of education in the state. The Black Panther Party would serve as watchdogs in the community to protect the elderly and children and the vulnerable. They even one time when there was a death at a certain intersection in California, they organized a campaign to make sure that a stoplight was installed. And they regularly escorted elderly to the bank for checks, and they traveled anywhere else people needed escorts or transportation. They ran a free lunch program as well. They held community and political education classes, and they provided food and clothes to anyone who presented a need. They organized neighborhood cleanups. And they did all of this at no cost to anyone in the community. They didn't take a salary. They didn't get tips. They didn't write grants. Some of them, like Ronald Allsworth, who is with us, if you don't mind, rise, interrupted college studies to take on the work of being a Black Panther Party member. Some, like Malik Rahim, if you don't mind, would you rise, juggle families to do the work of the Black Panther Party. Some, like Jason Lawrence, if you don't mind, rise, and Steve Green, who is not with us, gave up their youth and their prime years to do the work of the Black Panther Party. Some, like Mariana Curry, who joined at the young age of 14. Brian Hunter, who joined at mere 15 years old. Some, like Robert King, if you don't mind, would you rise, who started the first party chapter back in Angola, along with you guys, as well. Some lost relationships over their affiliation with the Black Panther Party. Others lost their literal freedom, and many more lost their sanity. And so you ask, why then, if they're so good, were they charged with so many crimes? There's a couple of reasons you should know. The first one is COINTELPRO, which is a short way of explaining the counterintelligence program that J. Edgar Hoover, started to neutralize those who promoted a civil rights agenda. J. Edgar Hoover declared the Black Panther Party national security cases, and he put many of them on the most wanted terrorist list in the country. He used every tactic imaginable to annihilate the Black Panther Party. Incidentally, I could not do this talk without mentioning that there were only 2 FBI officials ever convicted of COINTELPRO offenses. They were Mark Felt and Edward Miller. They never served a single day in jail. Why? Because they were granted full and unconditional pardons by Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan didn't do this in private. He publicly gave his reasons, and I want to share those, so I'm quoting at this point. Reagan said, "I felt putting all of this behind us and forgiving those who engage in excesses during the civil rights era was the right thing to do for the nation." Another reason for all of these criminal cases is the governor of Louisiana at the time, who was John J. McKithen. And he said out in public again that the Black Panther Party would not take a foothold in the state of Louisiana. And so now what has largely been suppressed about the Black Panther Party is in many instances where there were criminal charges lodged against them, those charges were dropped, or those charges were never successfully pursued by the prosecutors that brought them. They were charged simply as a COINTELPRO tactic in order to remove them from the communities and kill their movement. For example, a New Orleans jury found a number of Louisiana Black Panther Party not guilty of attempted murder. That was after months of being on death row, waiting simply to go to trial. If you're in the audience and you are part of that, would you please rise to be acknowledged? Also in 1970, there were 13 New York Panthers prosecuted for shooting at police and trying to blow up police stations. They too sat in jail awaiting trial for an 8-month period. The jury eventually acquitted all of these defendants of 156 charges. Entry was being refused to court when Huey Newton was on trial in 1968. The response from the public was so great The courtroom was simply too small to hold all of the people who wanted to watch. The Black Panthers did something interesting. They asked the court for permission to move that trial to a public auditorium. So what does that transparency suggest to you? Now, by this point in time, the history of this country, we've entered into a number of settlements and civil cases involving Black Panther Party members, such as the Angola Three, such as Fred Hampton, such as Geronimo Pratt. Now, why would the government do that if they did not bear any fault? So I want to make it very clear that we should never equate the Black Panther Party with a gang or as a group of degenerates.
Absolutely.
I also want to note that the Black Panther Party is not analogous to the Ku Klux Klan.
Right.
In the year 1866, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a former Confederate general, formed the first Ku Klux Klan in the country. He was joined by 5 other rebels. Why did they form this group? They formed in response to the federal government coming down south, trying to force the acts of Congress that would have gave Black people in the South equal protection and political rights. The Ku Klux Klan has only 4 goals. 1, violence. 2, intimidation. 3, to terrorize. And 4, to prevent a Black vote or Black rule. The Ku Klux Klan did not have an educational component. They didn't have a platform. In fact, they did not even require that members had a brain. The only qualifications were that you needed a role and you needed to be willing to engage in acts of domestic terrorism. And so I say to you, the Black Panthers and the Ku Klux Klans, they're incongruous. They should never, ever be compared. The next thing that I wish to dispel is that the Black Panther Party was not welcomed in the communities they served or by the government anywhere in this country. The Black Panthers targeted very specific areas to apply their efforts. And they lived and worked in places that were usually crime-infected and very neglected by the local municipalities. There's one published court case in New Orleans that speaks about Black voters being denied the opportunity to sit on juries in Louisiana. And so those Black folks in the Desire Housing Project went to court to challenge the fact that jury summonses were not being served to them, which meant they could not sit on juries. And so we get the city officials under oath in court, and this is a published case, and ask them, is it true? Is it true that you're not serving these jury summonses, which means that the juries will always be underrepresented? And those officials said, yes, it's true. We're not going to try to lie. We didn't serve them, and we won't be serving them. And they said, why? And they said the Desire Housing Projects is way too dangerous. It's not safe for us to go in there and try to serve any jury services, but guess where the Black Panther Party worked? They worked in that very same Desire Housing Project in New Orleans. And not only did they go in there to work, but they also lived in that same housing project. Why? Because their service was their love language to Black people. They achieved great success in those projects. In fact, the Desire residents once took a stand against the police department when law enforcement showed up to arrest those Panthers. And as a result, law enforcement retreated that day. In 1968, Huey Lewis was on trial. The news accounts of that trial describe several thousand people gathered outside of court on a regular basis. Why? Because the communities trusted the Black Panther Party and they appreciated all of their sacrifices. So the idea that they were ever unwanted is also a lie that we must dispel. Now there is this rumor that these people amongst us are somehow disrespectful of the rule of law. So I'd like to dispel that as well. In many instances, you will see the Black Panther Party taking the act to go into civil court preemptively, to ask the courts to intervene because they did not want to have a conflict with law enforcement or with any civil official or public official. And so there are many court cases where they're going in asking for injunctions. For example, in New Orleans, when they were trying to evict them, the Panthers went to court and asked for an injunction. So I want to start by making sure when we hear that they are not people who respect the rule of law, we understand that that is a blatant falsehood. And they did this often because they wanted to avert problems. They didn't want to be involved in problems. So for example, in Dallas, there's a case where the Panthers go into court and ask for an unauthorized group to stop using their name in their image. There's another case when their former leader of the New York Black Panther Party chapter goes to court to seek relief against the FBI because they are engaging in illegal wiretaps. This is not the way lawless people settle scores. And there's a lot of evidence in those court cases about who did disrespect the rule of law. For example, in New York court case, guess what the government did? They simply disregarded court orders telling them they needed to produce evidence. And guess what happened? The court is issuing sanctions against the government, not against the Black Panther Party. In a case involving the attempt by law enforcement to remove the Black Panther Party in New Orleans from their office, there is testimony in that record where the officer who went into the magistrate actually lied under oath in order to obtain the warrant that was used to cause that shootout in the end. In the Angola 3 case, there was hidden evidence for over 43 years. Illegal juries, illegal grand juries. They used misrepresentations to the community at the point that bond was being issued for Albert Woodfox. And another theme that emerges through these cases is that the Panthers were often met with disrespect and official misconduct during these court proceedings, such as the instance when the Panthers were engaged in a battle with the government for violating their 4th and 14th Amendment rights. That litigation continued for 7 straight years. So here the judge says to the Panthers at the 7-year mark, and I'm quoting the judge, "The Panthers, you are becoming harassing to the government for pursuing this case this long." That is a part of the court record. Another observation is that when the Panthers were guilty of things, they took ownership often. They stood up and said, "I did it. I'm guilty, sentence me." When the government was wrong, you often see them hiding behind the shield of immunity. And despite constant arrests, constant judicial abuses, nearly every member of the Black Panther Party consistently retained lawyers and fought cases in court. The Black Panther Party even sought help from the United Nations at one point when it became clear that the court system in the United States was being used to neutralize them. They showed tremendous respect for the rule of law, and they got hardly any back. The next point is that the Black Panther Party is not an anti-government or an anti-American organization. The Panthers, many of them served their country honorably. In Louisiana specifically, Steve Green, or Green Steve, some days he's either or, he's the founder of the National Committee Against Fascism. He is a veteran. Malik Rahim, who is seated behind me, is a veteran. Alton Edwards, Leroy Jones, Herbert McGee. And then out of state, the same pattern happens. Bobby Seale, co-founder, served in the Air Force. Elmer Geronimo Pratt, who is from Louisiana but served nationally, served in the Army, but as I said at his memorial, I learned something I didn't know, which was that he was highly decorated. He had 2 Purple Hearts. He was a sergeant after 2 tours in Vietnam. He had a Silver Star, and he had a Bronze Star. Black Panther Party members have also been president in government offices. Bobby Rush has served in Congress, and he also is a veteran, I might add. Bobby Seale ran for mayor in California. Malik Rahim has run for the city council as well as Congress. And so let's think now on a very basic level, as you hear these allegations of them being anti-government, how is it possible when the larger part of their work was organizing people to work in this political structure? How is it possible when they were registering voters to vote in this political structure? So we see clearly there is no merit to this as well. And I don't agree with characterizing the Black Panther Party as violent. Sometimes the media reports contributed to this idea of them being a violent group, and I'll give you a great example. At one point, the Black Panther Party approached the California legislature because there was a debate ongoing that day about a change in the gun laws. And so they wanted to participate in this hearing to voice their views about this potential change. And so when they get there, they're possessing their arms, which happens to be legal. Not just legal that they possess them, but legal that they're armed as they enter that building that day. Despite that, they were arrested. They were charged with conspiracy to disrupt a legislative session, which was a felony. But I want you to listen to how the news describes the event. So I'm going to read you the caption from the article. It says, "Armed Black Panthers invade Capitol." Another contributor to this theory of violence was that the FBI often inserted infiltrators and agents into the group, and they would instruct them to act in violent ways. And as a result, that violence that was being performed by those agents was oftentimes attributed to members of the Black Panther Party because they assumed that identity for that moment. And then there's another reason. Sometimes it was due to their speeches that they gave, sometimes the language they used, sometimes the papers they printed gave people the sense that they wanted confrontation because they often spoke of the word revolution. And so people termed that revolution as an expression of violence. But the Panthers, when they said revolution, were not meaning violent revolution. They were meaning revolution in the sense that people would become the revolution. That education would teach people how to cause a rise. Education would inspire people through action, not through violence. And so what they were describing as a revolution is through democratic participation. And they wanted the revolution of people holding office and the revolution of Black people voting because they saw this as our way of getting equality. And so the co-founder, Bobby Seale, explains that, in his words, revolution is all about re-evolving. It was about putting political and economical and social power back in the hands of the people. And so that's why he said we would call the Black Panther Party for self-defense, right? Because it was all about educating people, but the weapons were there not because of aggression. The weapons were there for us to protect and defend. And then some of them say, Emory Douglas, your artwork maybe caused some damage to the party. It caused people to think you all were violent. But Douglas explains that I use these images because it was never my intent to incite any violence. He wanted his art to show the cause of oppression. He wanted it to grab people so they could see that oppression was being caused by these things he illustrated. But he also wanted the art to encourage self-empowerment, to provoke action. A new level of consciousness is the way he explains it. And then there's one aspect of this violence narrative that is clear. And what is clear is that the Black Panther Party often were met with violence. And that violence was often initiated by official actors. So I can say with a clear conscience that indiscriminate violence was not a touchstone of the Black Panther Party. But I also know pacifism wasn't either, okay? So you may be wondering now, if all of this happened already, why keep dredging this stuff up? Why not just leave the past in the past? So here are a few good reasons to consider. First and foremost, at this moment, justice-impacted people all over the country are being punished for possessing anything that says Black Panther Party. Even books that are written by academic scholars is considered now contraband in prison. And prison administrators call them incendiary. They often classify them as gang literature, as violent organization, as a disruptive group. And they even equate the new and the old Black Panthers and mix up the points and objectives. And so now you see punishment behind walls simply because people want to possess this Black Panther Party material, or even maybe want to replicate some of the lessons that they taught. And if you're like the Angola 3, you're actually subject to prolonged periods of solitary confinement simply because of your affiliation with the group. And so knowledge in these institutions is actually considered contraband. But I also find that in the free world, there's some of that also. Knowledge becomes contraband. Why? Because in schools now, students are also deprived of these rich lessons around the Black Panther Party because of these false narratives. Another thing to consider is the important work of memorialization. That is one of the key ways that global societies transform from human rights abuses into something a lot more functional. And when we do memorialization, it's all about memory. The memory that we keep in society, the things that we have on display for people to see, open the blind eye. It gives people an opportunity, if they were to see the positives about the Black Panther Party, a story about resistance. It would also call people to action because there would be a social imperative. It would also allow us to see ourselves, Black people in particular, as enough, as sufficient. But when we do the work of memorialization, the project that we have to keep in mind is that it's not only what you take down from societies, it's also important what you put up. And the putting up of anything representative of the Black Panther Party has yet to come. And so we have First Lady Mildred Aristide saying to us that it's good to stop talking about the past if the past wasn't so present. But the area of criminalizing and scandalizing and neutralizing Black movements continue. We see this through the way Black Lives Matter activists were subject to some of the same tactics as the Black Panther Party, but we also see it at this very moment happening to the Cop City activists who are now facing RICO charges for their activism. So this history here that we're talking about in the room tonight, it has to be studied by future activists as a prerequisite, in my opinion, to doing movement work today. Yeah. There is a final reason here that we should never let this conversation be silenced, and that is because the Black Panther Party's work of inspiring Black children to become disciplined and educated is unmatched. And this city and this country needs the knowledge that this group holds about this particular work. The Black Panther Party represented something positive, something immeasurable to this country's social and historic work, and something profoundly misunderstood. And while the Black Panther Party's organizational lifespan lasted only 16 years, their contribution to America is endless. It was a citizens' complaint board to hear allegations of police misconduct that was established by the Oakland City Council 14 years after the Black Panther Party launched its community police patrols. And this model has now been replicated and reused across the country. The Black Panther Party taught us how to effectively use multicultural alliances. Their emphasis on community-based initiatives laid the foundation for many of our modern social justice movements. Their breakfast program and their food giveaways raised public consciousness about hunger and poverty in the United States, and they became precursors to the present free school lunch programs that we've all come to know. Panther activism also provides us some of community self-help. And their efforts where sickle cell anemia is concerned laid the groundwork for all the medical awareness now that exists. The New Orleans chapter has this legacy they nearly eradicated: despair and violence and crime in the areas that they worked. And so what I see as I describe the Panthers is a model of this agape love that I learned in my religion class right here in New Orleans at Xavier Prep. I was taught about how people as Christians should model agape love, how they should love humanity in biblical ways, and that's what I see in the Panthers, in a way that I've never seen in the church, in a way that I've never seen in another group. I say that with visions at this moment of Betty Toussaint, if you don't mind, would you rise, who was being shot at, I say, by law enforcement while she was defenseless inside their New Orleans office. And then she was later charged with 6 counts of attempted murder and criminal anarchy. She was hospitalized and then jailed and then tried, and loving strangers enough after all of that to keep going and to keep doing this work, in particular to return right back to that Black Panther Party in New Orleans. And to Malik Rahim and Ronald Allsworth, if you rise when you hear your name, for being targets of assassination plots. And for General Rico and Steve Green for also facing criminal charges, arrest, neutralization, and for loving people enough to manifest that revolutionary spirit. To all of my Black Panther brothers and sisters, you are long-distance runners. Had the Black Panther Party not been neutralized, I am certain that people of color would have lower rates of divorce, incarceration, crime, and higher literacy rates and economic prowess in this country. The Panthers' influence even reached in international spheres. For example, all the way in India, where there's a caste system, there's a group called the Dalalitas, and they created something called the Dalalita Panthers. Why? Because the Panthers gave them hope. In the final analysis, the Black Panthers, those both present and those who have already transitioned, those named tonight and those unnamed, they were not just revolutionaries. They were men of steel and they were women of iron, as Sonny wishes now to speak to us a little more about.